So as Michael just mentioned, for the next two homilies starting today, I'm going to be focused on my own personal cosmology, giving you some ideas about what a personal cosmology is and what I've developed for myself by way of a cosmology, and invite every one of you to develop your own cosmology. So I've chosen 3 short readings that speak about being awake or being conscious. The first one is from the Buddha, the second one from Socrates, and the third from Jesus. So the Buddha flourished between 563 BCE and 483 BCE. And this reading is about the meaning of the title Buddha. It wasn't his name, it was a title he actually gave himself. So Buddha means awakened one or enlightened one. And it is the masculine form of Bud, which means to wake, be awake, observe, heed, attend, learn, become aware of, to know, be conscious again, to awaken, to open up as a flower does. One who was awakened from the deep sleep of ignorance and opened his consciousness to encompass all objects of knowledge. So that's the meaning of the title when he said, I am awake. That's what he had in mind. Socrates flourished between 469 BCE and 399 BCE. And just a single phrase I want to use of his where he said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And these were words he spoke when he was being condemned to commit suicide. He was being tried for heresies of various kinds, and this was his statement. He'd rather, examine his life and come to his own conclusions, than drink the kind of the Kool-Aid of the society in which he grew up. So the unexamined life is not worth living. And then Jesus, and this is semi-heretical, Jesus flourished between 6 BCE and 30 CE. When you actually look at the evidence in the scriptures, he was not born in 0. He was born in 6 BCE, 2 years before Herod died. And we know Herod's death was in 4 BC. We know this from the secular history. So according to Matthew chapter 24, Christ said, but understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. These are words inspired by God. So for the 14 years that I lived in Kenya, I lived pretty much on the equator. I moved between 4 or 5 different missions in 14 years, but they were all just around the equator. And the last mission particularly was a place called Kipsaraman, literally the place of the twins. And it was just literally about maybe 10 miles from the equator. And so, the sun pretty much got up at 6 o'clock in the morning and went to bed at 6 p.m. in the evening. And the villagers tended to kind of just follow the sun. But being Irish, there was no way I was going to go to bed at 6 o'clock at night. So I lived in this really remote area, and the light was candlelight. And I spent my hours very, very often. I looked at my entire personal cosmology, my belief systems, the philosophy of life, being an Irish Catholic. And one by one, I began to kind of examine the tenets of my belief system and figure out which of these actually made sense to me and which didn't. And so I was put them into 2 buckets, stuff I could no longer believe and stuff that I believe because any spiritual person would come to the same conclusion, whether they were born Hindu or Buddhist or Catholic. And so I created this personal cosmology for myself way back then. So for the month of December then, I've chosen, rather than taking a single theme, to take 2 themes. So for the first 2 Sundays, I'm going to focus on how you might develop your own personal cosmology. And I'll talk about my own cosmology then. And then for the last 2 Sundays of December, I want to focus on children as our teachers. So let me begin then with the notion of a personal cosmology. So what I present today then is it's a kind of a telescope version of 77 years of life, 59 years as a meditator, and 51 years as a priest. And so it's a map of my belief system. Now, a map obviously is not the terrain, and a cosmology is not the same thing as a reality, but we need guidelines in order to kind of help us to maneuver through the vicissitudes of life. And so it's important that even though we develop our cosmologies, that we don't kind of, that we're not open to continuing to have them grow. So there's a famous statement in Buddhism that says, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. In other words, if you're if you attach yourself to a belief system, and it's kind of ruling you, be very, very careful. You must be open constantly to upgrading it. And Meister Eckhart in the 1300s said the very same kind of thing. He said, I prayed daily to God to rid me of God. In other words, any theologian who thinks that they've captured the essence of the divine, is fooling themselves. And so you must constantly try to upgrade and understand the relationship you have with Source itself. So let me dig into it then. What do I mean by a personal cosmology? It's a kind of a philosophy of life. And every single one of us has a personal cosmology or a philosophy of life, but it has been unconsciously acquired. We got it from our parents, from our school system, from the newspapers, from television, from the priests. So it's been unconsciously taken aboard, and it's unconsciously accessed. You put us in any life situation and we're going to respond. Either we say something or do something, but mainly it's based on an unconsciously acquired set of values and belief systems and ideals. Very, very, very few people have actually sat down and examined, why do I believe A? Why not B instead of A? And so the job of this incarnational journey is to try to bring our personal cosmologies into full consciousness and to examine tenet by tenet and belief system by belief system, that which guides our very, very, very life. And so that's why he chose Socrates saying, the unexamined life is not worth living, and Gautama Siddhartha calling himself the Buddha, the awakened one, and Jesus Christ saying, if the householder knew at what stage the thief was going to break in and steal, he wouldn't go to sleep. In other words, stay awake. So coming awake is vitally important. So when we set about trying to create a personal cosmology, I believe that the skeleton of it, or the four core questions around which we fashion a personal cosmology, are the answers to the four following questions. Who is God? Who do I think that God is? Is God some kind of a distant, demanding deity, who punishes sin? Or is God the loving, source who has no judgment whatsoever and loves us unconditionally? Secondly, when you say I, what do you mean by I? Are you identified with the ego, or with your relationships, or with the profession you're in, or your body, or your mind, or your emotions? So when you say I, what do you mean by I? Thirdly, what do you mean by neighbor? Is neighbor the guy at the other side of the white picket fence, or the person who thinks like you think, or the person who's the same color as you? Or what do you mean when you say neighbor? And fourthly, what is mission? Why have you come down here? What is your purpose in choosing to incarnate? So the answers to these four questions create a kind of a scaffolding around which you can then build your cosmology. And I believe that an adequate cosmology has the four following kind of characteristics. The first thing is, it must make your soul sing. If you've really found a philosophy of life that's meaningful to you, it'll actually make your soul sing, because the essence of you, the holographic fractal of Source that you are, will recognize it as truth. So your soul will sing. But secondly, it must stretch you out of your comfort zone. If your personal cosmology is such that you're dead happy to be who you are, but not to grow or stretch, then it is not an adequate cosmology. Thirdly, it must be able to explain every single experience you have, every single one. It's not adequate if there are huge areas that it can't deal with. So everything, literally, from mystical experiences to the possibility of extraterrestrial travelers, it must be able to explain all things, whether you say, yes, here's something I've considered and I'm rejecting it, or here's something I've considered and I'm accepting it. And then fourthly, it has to be constantly updated. Because as you have new experiences, you attempt to cram the new experiences into the old model. At some stage, you can tweak the existing model and it will accommodate the new experiences. But at some stage, there will be new anomalous kind of data that enter your experience. And no matter what you do to the old cosmology, it will not contain them. So you have to dismantle it and create a brand new cosmology that's able to kind of accommodate all the old data, all the old experiences, and all of the new ones as well as you continue to grow. So that was the process that I went through personally. And to begin with, I had to try to define a few key terms for myself so that I have some kind of navigational aids. And the 4 words that I felt I needed to kind of redefine for myself was the notion of reality. What do I mean by reality? Secondly, what do I mean by truth? Thirdly, what do I mean by memory? And fourthly, what do I mean by imagination? So as I use these words, here's what I mean by them. So reality. Materialistic science tells us that something is real only if it can be kind of grokked by the sensorium or by our equipment, which is kind of extensions of our sensorium. So for them, if it can't be measured empirically, then it doesn't exist. I believe that when I think of reality, everything you sense, everything you feel, everything you think, everything you remember, everything you dream, everything you choose, or everything you imagine is real. They're all parts of reality. They are different levels of reality, some more pristine than others, but every experience you have is real. You're really having it. Even somebody who's having a psychotic break, they're having a real experience. So it may not correspond, empirically with what others are sensing in the same situation, but for the person to experience it, it is absolutely real. And so we have to realize that, in talking about reality, we have to take all experiences into account and build our cosmologies accordingly. I've defined many, many times what I think truth is. And I've said that for me, I do not believe something can be true, but not factual, and something can be factual, but not true. So my definition of truth is that something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with God. And so the difference between truth and facts or factoids are only important in order to help us manipulate in the physical world. But truth is much more important in helping us to kind of navigate in the metaphysical and the esoteric world as well as in the physical world. So I've given the famous example of the Good Samaritan, where Christ tells a story about a man who was mugged and left to kind of die at the side of the road. And he's a Jewish man. He's on his way down to Jericho. And from the temple goes and ignores him because to touch a dead body would render him unclean. And a Levite, who were the temple kind of the liturgists or the temple police, passes by and sees a fellow Jew dying at the side of the road and ignores him as well. And then finally, a Samaritan, who were the kind of sworn enemies of the Israelites at that stage, sees this Jewish man, has pity for him, picks him up, brings him down to Jericho on his own donkey, checks in at a hotel, attends to his wounds, and then picks up the tab. Now, if you were a reporter for the Jerusalem Post and you heard Jesus telling this story, you think this is really, really fishy. And you go to the temple and you check with the priests and the Levites, and it didn't happen. There were none of them down in Jericho in the last month. And you go to Jericho and you interview the innkeepers of Jericho, and it never happened. And you come back and you say to Jesus, that's a crock. That never happened. Maybe it wasn't factual, but was it true? It was absolutely true. Because what Jesus was saying is everybody is your neighbor. And so people who understood the message were radically transformed, and their sociological understanding was radically transformed. So this was something that was deeply true, but may or may not have been factual. So that's what I mean when I talk about truth. When I think about memory, I'm looking at an entire spectrum of memory. So there's something which is called eidetic memory, which is the little memory that remains in your senses for a few seconds after you've experienced something. So you see something or you hear something, and for a few seconds in your eidetic memory, you've captured the essence of what you've seen or heard. And then at some stage, it goes into short-term memory, which is much longer than eidetic memory. And then eventually it works its way into long-term memory. But I believe that the memories of an entire lifetime and of all the lifetimes you've ever lived are available to you. So you don't just have memories about things that happened to you in this particular incarnation. You have memories available to you of everything that ever happened to you in all of your incarnations. And then you have what Hindus will call the Akashic record. The records of everything that has ever happened in any dimension of God's manifest realms has been recorded. So every creature, every sentient being, is in some senses populating the Akashic records with their own doings. So it's like you put on on the cloud, you can have photographs from a trip you've taken, and other people have access to that if you give them the key. And so in some senses, when I say memory, I mean that we literally have access to all of God's data. So it's a question of, getting into the kind of mystical state in which you can recover those data, no matter who's experienced them, in what dimension, at what stage of history. It's all available, in different states of a consciousness. And then when I use the word imagination, I differentiate between fantasy and imagination. Fantasy is making up stuff that's not true. Imagination is the ability to kind of shift my state of consciousness, enter into different dimensions, encounter entities and energies in those different dimensions, dialogue with them, cross-fertilize their teachings with my own, and then come back, and cross-fertilize it with my waking consciousness. So fantasy is just making stuff up, whereas imagination is actually traveling up through the dimensions. And I think actually that imagination is the single most important gift of a real artist and of a real science, because science is really based on imagination, on leaps of creativity, not just on technical data. After the scientist has made those leaps of creativity, then the technicians can come in, and create, extraordinary applications for it. But the imaginative leaps is a sign for me of the real artist and the real scientist. So now I want to say, in my own personal cosmology, when I think of God, when I answer the question for myself, who is God? Here's what I come up with. I really believe at the core of my being that the only thing that exists is God. And that everything is simply an emanation or an articulation of the divine. I've used the phrase many times that everything that exists is simply a holographic fractal of source, a hologram being that which contains the totality of itself in every one of its component parts, and a fractal being that which is an image which is scaled up at different levels. And so only God exists, and everything else is actually an emanation or an articulation of that source. But in struggling with this concept, we kind of divided God into two aspects. So the transcendence of God, or the kind of the isness of God, is totally ineffable, and we can say nothing about it. It's a radical mystery, a way and above our pay grade to be able to wrestle with it. Whereas the other aspect is the immanence of God as she moves through her manifestation. And it is the immanence of God that we can experience. And so, for instance, when Christian theology talks about, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, they're not talking about discrete persons in a Trinity. They're talking about three different modalities in which we can experience the immanence of God, but they say nothing about the transcendence of God. And the mistake we make is that we think that God actually is a Father, Son, and Spirit. That is just their kind of masks that, in some senses, the immanence of God wears in order for us to have experiences of God. So that's the first thing I would say about God. Secondly, there are 5 things I don't believe about God, which are pushed very often in the theologies of the world. I don't believe God is a person. I don't believe God is a creator. I don't believe that God is a covenant maker. I don't believe that God is a micromanager. And I do not believe that God is partisan. So let me take those one by one. So God is not a person and does not have human attributes. Rather, we project our virtues and our vices onto God. And I wrote an entire book on that topic, setting God free, moving beyond the caricature we've created in our own image. So the thing is, I'm a person and I can only have a personal relationship with God, but that doesn't make God a person. I live in the middle of the forest. I have a personal relationship with the forest. The forest is not a person. And so God is not a person in the sense in which we typically believe so. So this notion of there being 3 discrete, ontologically separate beings sitting in heaven, one a Father, one a Son, and one a Spirit, I do not believe that. I do not believe that that God is a creator in the sense that God goes into his workshop on a Monday and says, okay, I think I'm going to make elephants today. And then on Tuesday, he decides to make planets. And then on Wednesday, he decides to make spiders. And then on Thursday, he decides to make galaxies. And then on Friday, he decides to make human beings. Rather, I believe that they're not discrete kind of creations from God. They're emanations from source. That source itself, emanates, and all of kind of manifestation is an emanation. And I've used this many, many times before. If you set, for instance, a daffodil bulb in the ground, and so it can't even be seen. And then at some stage in maybe late March, a big green stalk works its way out of the ground. And then at some stage, this beautiful yellow flower comes out. So did the bulb create the stalk? And did the stalk create the flower? No. All of our manifestations already hidden in the essence of the bulb. And to use a kind of a famous Hindu notion, where the teacher asks a student, pick me a fruit. Now open it up. What do you see inside in it? I see a seed. Split the seed. What do you see inside the seed? And the guy says, nothing. There's nothing there. And the teacher says to him, and from that nothing, this fruit emerged and this tree emerged. So it is the no-thingness of God, in some senses, that's responsible for everything that is. So it's an emanation from source itself. I do not believe that God is a covenant maker. I do not believe that God has special relationships or makes particular kinds of agreements with any group, whether they're the Jews or the Catholics. There's any group that claims to have a special relationship with God is like a small child who wants a special relationship with his daddy, and he doesn't want his siblings to get the same kind of attention. So God is not a covenant maker. He's not making deals with our agreements with any group and saying, you do X and I will do Y. I do not believe that God is a micromanager. He doesn't insert himself into human affairs and get upset when we don't follow his laws. So he's not micromanaging, what's happening on planet Earth. God, as a loving parent, is allowing the kids to kind of learn, both from their own personal triumphs and their own personal failures. And then finally, I do not believe that God is partisan in any way. So rather that everything that exists is a word of God made flesh, and not even Jesus. When I take the statement in the beginning of John's Gospel, the prologue to John's Gospel, where it says very famously, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were created through him, and without him was made nothing that was made. In him was life, and this life was the life of human beings. And then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we think that's only happened once, that somehow the second person of the Trinity decided to incarnate, call himself Jesus of Nazareth, and then, he and only he is the Word of God made flesh. I believe that everything that exists is a Word of God made flesh. I don't care how lowly it is, whether you're talking about a kind of a snail on the ground, a bunny rabbit in the forest, an oak tree in the forest, a human being, or an avatar. Everything that exists is a Word of God made flesh. It's only a question of how much self-awareness is there within the individual kind of creation. How aware is a rock of itself? How aware is a bunny rabbit of itself? How aware is a human being of itself? How aware is a kind of a mystic of herself? So it's a question of the level of self-awareness that kind of differentiates the entire spectrum of what we see. Widen out the scope a little bit. I believe in what I call a metaverse. I believe that we live in a metaverse that has given birth to a pluriformity of multiverses. And I think that this particular universe has actually billions. Obviously, at this stage, we know it has billions of exoplanets, revolving around suns and various solar systems and various galaxies. And so to think that life only exists on this one planet of ours is absolutely ridiculous. There are many life forms out there, I'm convinced, that are much, much more advanced than we. So how did life get onto planet Earth then? I believe personally that life started elsewhere long, long before it came to planet Earth. And that there were very, very complex life forms on other areas of the universe before Earth was seeded. We know, for instance, that planet Earth at the moment is about 13.8 billion years. Sorry, the universe is about 13.8 billion years old, whereas planet Earth is only 4.6 billion years old. And so there are parts of our universe which are literally 3 times older than us. So there are like parts of the universe which have had a 10 billion year start on planet Earth itself. I believe then that at some stage, life was planted, on planet Earth. By whom or how? It's interesting, in a famous interview, Sir Francis Crick, who was the co-discoverer of DNA, in an interview said one time that he believed that life on planet Earth arrived through what he called directed panspermia, that some kind of seedlings came from outer space and landed on planet Earth. And he was asked by the interviewer, how did they get here? And he shocked the interviewer by saying they came in specially designed capsules. Now, what does that mean? That life forms arrived on planet Earth through a directed panspermia in designed capsules, according to Francis. So I believe that there are many different extraterrestrial societies, much more advanced than we, and that they visited this planet and that they treated it like a garden. And so they planted life here. They came back and they weeded it. They fertilized it. They grafted other life forms onto it, and they genetically modified it. And then finally, we read in the Judeo-Christian scriptures that they created us in their own image and likeness, meaning that they finally bred a life form that somehow resembled those who planted the garden. So what would that look like? So are these gardeners the kind of God or the ineffable source? I think absolutely not. We're simply talking about some advanced civilizations. And then we find a very strange passage in the book of Genesis in chapter 6, where it says that the sons of God found the daughters of men to be very attractive, and they took them to wife, as many as they wanted, and they bred a race of giants called the Nephilim. So according to the Judeo-Christians itself, whoever these beings were that planted life on planet Earth and created us in their own image and likeness, obviously weren't source itself if they could have physical kind of intercourse with human beings. There's a phenomenon which is called cargo cults. So during World War II, when Japanese and American air forces landed in some of the Polynesian islands, they brought supplies with them. And the local population thought that they were gods. And so once the war had ended and they were no longer coming back, the locals began to create rituals of various kinds, imitating runways and imitating kind of aerials and stuff like that, to try to persuade these guys to come back down. And hence we get the notion of the cargo cults, because these Japanese and American air forces were bringing cargo with them and gifts to the people. So they wanted them to come back to continue to give them their gifts. So in many senses, a lot of religion, as distinct from spirituality, they're totally different. I believe that a lot of religion is literally the false worship of advanced civilizations by primitive people. And we are a very primitive people. Most of our religion, is literally predicated on the huge technological difference between advanced civilizations elsewhere and human civilizations here. Now, that's very distinct from spirituality, which is always a kind of a divine impulse. But so many of the world religions and their systems are literally the false worship of just alien civilizations, in my opinion. So once life is planted on planet Earth, what my belief system is, I call it the grand sweep of evolution. How did it continue to proceed once it had been planted and weeded, etc.? So Darwin had three basic principles for his evolutionary model. The first one was spontaneous mutation, that genes just kind of reproduce themselves again and again and again, and 99% of it don't get us anywhere, but occasionally 1 in 100 will get us kind of an upgrade in some way. So that's the first one, spontaneous mutation. Then natural selection, that nature will favor the strong, and that they will have the breeding rights. And then thirdly, that this process is a slow, gradual ascent into complexity. Now, I don't agree with him on these three. So I believe that it's not a spontaneous mutation, but that there's a teleological sense to the evolution, that there's an endpoint. Every little acorn, has a teleology that allows it to become an oak tree. It's going to take 50 years for a typical acorn to become an oak tree capable of dropping its own acorns. But locked within every single little acorn is a vision of being an oak tree that will drop its own acorns. So there's a teleology, there's like a beckoning forward by some kind of an intelligent plan. So I believe that there's intelligence guiding this process. I believe as well that, as well as natural selection is not just based on kind of physical traits or kind of strengths of character, but it has to do with the natural selection of souls that are more and more kind of aligned with God. That the selection that happens is not just kind of dog eat dog, but that is based on some kind of cooperation and symbiosis in nature as well. And in fact, there's no evidence whatsoever in the fossil record that evolution happened in this gradual ascent. There's a famous, I think it was a Harvard biologist called Stephen Jay Gould, who talked about punctuated equilibria, that evolution seems to just be stable. Evolution is just tabled out for long periods of time, and then there's a sudden jump, and then it's stable again. And he called that, punctuated equilibria. And so you can actually demonstrate this with, like, say, fruit flies, whose lifespan is about 3 days. So you got like 120 generations in a year. And what happens with fruit flies is that for 30 or 40 generations, there's zero changes to their biology. And then suddenly some new feature arrives. And then for the next 100 iterations, there's no change again. And then there's another jump. So Stephen Jay Gould would call this punctuated equilibria, that there are the evolution is not this kind of gradual ascent into complexity, but rather some events seem to trigger a significant sudden shift occasionally. So I think that's how life develops on planet Earth. I want to dismantle then for myself a few what I call anthropocentric myths, particularly when we grew up in a kind of a Judeo-Christian model. So one myth is that there's only one universe and there's only life on one planet in this universe. The second myth for me is that we claim that the only species that has a soul is human beings. A third myth is we only get one shot at life and then it's heaven or hell. I disagree, obviously, with all three of these. I do not believe that there is only life on this one planet. And I do not believe that only human beings have a soul. And I do not believe that we only get one shot at it and then there's a judgment and we get a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So let me finish then with the notion of the soul. And then next week, God willing, I'll pick up on the rest of my cosmology. Are we the only creatures that have souls? I believe that at least every sentient being has a soul, but that there are different levels of soul. There's the one kind of soul that kind of animates flora, another kind of version that animates fauna, another version that animates human beings, another version that animates the very planet itself, another intelligence, our soul, that's the soul of a particular galaxy. And I've shared with you many times a powerful vision I had many, many years ago, where I saw souls standing in front of God and volunteering for incarnation in various ways. And there was this one great soul, whom I called Gaia, who stood in front of God and said, send me to that planet, the third rock from the sun in that system, and I will breed life until I manage to throw up a life form capable of recognizing its own divinity, and ipso facto, the divinity of all other creatures with whom it shares the planet. And the rock at that stage was about maybe 1 billion years old. And so beginning 3.7 billion years ago, we get the first advances of life, single-celled creatures that become more and more complex until finally human beings arrive on the stage. And so the question is, are we the ones who will recognize both our own divinity and the divinity of everything else that exists? Are we going to blow ourselves to smithereen by trashing our mother, Gaia, the planet itself, Pachamama, or destroying ourselves in a nuclear holocaust, or just being so cut off from God that we can't recognize either our own divinity or the divinity of everything else that exists? But I believe that everything has a soul of some level, from spiders to elephants to daffodils, and they're all precious to God. For me, God is no less enamored of banana slugs than he is of avatars. They're all part of this emanation from source, and they're all delivering different kinds of experiences to God, each experience of which, in some senses, advances and progresses and develops God herself in her immanence, not in her transcendence. Now, I do not believe, finally, that there's only just one lifetime in which to accomplish this journey of evolution. We get as many lifetimes as we need until we finally realize that ultimately that only God is real. And I've said this many times to you, that I believe that life as we live it is simply a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that God is having. And I will continue with this thesis next Sunday, God willing. and the creek don't rise. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.